Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Thought Leaders Live, where we talk with thought leaders in business, life, and in all points in between. Today, really excited. Got a Friday special with you, Dr. Michael Walker. I'm going to call you Mike, as you mentioned before, a certified executive and leadership coach. And through his practice, dynamic decisions coaching, Mike helps leaders see possibilities, navigate transitions, and make decisions with intention and confidence. And we're going to talk a whole lot about decisions, Mike. We were talking a lot about it before the show. And I think he's got some amazing, fascinating data to share with us and just more insights. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so let's dig right in. Let's start out first with your own personal journey. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'd like to toss out quickly is context. As I'm born in Australia, I grew up in Mexico City. I raised my family in Honolulu, Hawaii. I've lived in California. I'm happily back in Nashville, Tennessee right now, where we were before we moved to Hawaii. But it's given me a lot of cultural context. I married my high school sweetheart, both from Mexico City. So we have a multicultural, bilingual household. But I bring that context to the work that I do with people and organizations.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you got into the field of decision making, because I think that's really your unique focus. I noticed you had the doctorate in neuroscience of decision making at Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. Tell us why you got down this path, and maybe a little bit more of your work history as well.
Yeah. So I'm an educator. I always knew I was going to be an educator. When I was in the fifth grade, I was determined I was going to be a PE teacher. That's still a goal of mine. I've yet to realize it, but I'm not done yet. But even when I graduated from high school, I went to the head of school there, and I sort of proclaimed that I wanted to come back and teach. But I did a senior project in high school, actually teaching. I was teaching Spanish to younger students. So I spent my career in education, but got into leadership early. That was always my intent when I finished my master's degree. But I was in my late 20s and was appointed a division head. But there's studies that show that actually people who get into leadership early are more inclined to lead later in life. So it took me to fascinating places, 7 different independent schools, spent 17 years at Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii, largest independent school in the country, but 150 years old. It's where President Obama graduated from.
I visited Punahou, yes.
And it was
Beautiful.
amazing, and we lived on campus. I mean, I just can't imagine a better way to raise our family, but also for my career. And it was really there. I mean, I've always had an interest in decision making. When I was 27 years old, my first board meeting, when I was at Hammond School in Columbia, South Carolina, the school was going through a difficult time. Literally, it was my first board meeting. And there were some big issues about the future of the school on the table. And I had a new baby on the way. And I remember sitting there wondering, mystified how we were making decisions. I mean, it's always been on my mind. And frankly, I wanted to be at the table where decisions were being made, and that was part of it. So when I was at Punahou, did a lot of facility work, multi-million-dollar decisions about school buildings and plants, and with some of the top developers and finance people. But again, I mean, decisions of magnitude, and it was always a bit mysterious to me about how we were making them. Or, for example, we used to allocate hundreds of thousands of dollars in professional development and training, but it wasn't clear to me, A, how the decisions were made, nor how did we know the allocation of resources was yielding the desired results. So that led me to my doctoral work, and I focused on the neuroscience decision because what I found is that we're neurologically hardwired with very identifiable tendencies. We call them heuristics, but we're not really aware of them. And if we're not aware of them, like sunken cost trap and confirmation bias and availability heuristic, so if we're not aware of them, we're making decisions that we're not really aware of. And that's why I say bring more intentionality to our decision making. So that's what I do. I work with people to provide them skills to help them recognize their own styles and tendencies, and then to help organizations and teams use frameworks and systems. And that's where the huge absence. I'll share some data with you in a minute, but I've now asked thousands of leaders, like, how do you, your team, your organization make decisions? And nobody really knows. We sit around tables, we have data, we have information, but we're not intentional. But we know it's like anything. If I'm more intentional about my piano playing or my golf, I'm going to be better. And the same is true. Why wouldn't it be true for decision making?
Yeah, this is one of those things that is part of everyday life. We kind of just take it for granted, though. And share with us some of the data that you alluded to.
Well, we started and we were chatting. And so, the research clearly shows that we make about 35,000 decisions a day, which is why we're exhausted at the end of the day. I mean, some of those decisions are like, what am I going to wear today? But that's why
Right.
people like Steve Jobs, I'm like, I'm not going to use brain cells or energy making those
Right.
kinds of decisions.
Yeah.
But some of these decisions are of magnitude and of consequence. And so how we look at them. And the point is that we're not really taught how to make decisions. And you just referenced it. Because we make decisions in life, we think that that's the right preparation for how we make decisions at work. And that's why when you sit around a table making decisions, everybody's sort of making decisions how they make decisions.
Yeah.
But that would be like, playing tennis without any rules. And so you need some rules. So a fascinating study, McKinsey Research, they surveyed over 1,200 leaders in Fortune 500 companies. And here's what they found. Executives spend about 40% of their time making decisions, but only 20% of them believe that that yields really good decisions or that time is productive. Only 28% felt their strategic decisions are actually really good. And 60% said that bad decisions are just as common as the good ones. But there's a cost. I mean, there's real cost for that. And they totaled up those 1,200, and that actually translated in 500,000 days every year spent engaged in meetings that were leading to unproductive decisions that cost over $250 million just in wages. I mean, we've all been in that. I've been writing about LinkedIn. I mean, I would sit in meetings and, in my mind, calculate these are some of the top leaders of an organization. And how much is that meeting costing? And if it's not efficient and it's effective, and then as I get into the research about decision making, here's some examples. I mean, I brought one from Hawaii. We all have examples, but when we were there, it was 2008, they were voting on the rail system in Honolulu. I don't know if it was up or being built when you were there, depending on how long you were there. But in 2008, they approved it. They started in 2011, had a $5 million budget. I was just there in April. It's now up to $12 billion. And it's not even projected to be completed to 2031. And I don't want to pick on Honolulu, Hawaii, because Atlanta has examples like that.
Yeah.
Boston have examples like that. And those are extreme examples. But the point is, highly educated people with access to very sophisticated data can make really poor decisions. And we do. And there's reasons for it. And it's remediable.
Before we get into some of those reasons why this happens, I think what you just said really struck a nerve with me in terms of meetings, because we all hate meetings, more or less. They tend to be very inefficient. I always say, if I was a CEO, I'd have 5-minute meetings so you could just get in there and get the real gist of what needs to be done quickly. What it's just listening to talk, Mike, it occurred to me that most of those meetings are spent talking endlessly in circles and going around. There's no process for the decision making. Nothing exists around that.
Less than 40% of organizations can recognize or articulate the process their teams or company uses to make decisions.
Wow.
And the premise is that, we have a problem and then we gather data. But we sit in those meetings and somebody's talking about data or somebody's back in analysis. Or here's something I point out is the difference between advocacy and inquiry
Hmm.
when making decisions. So one of the things that I recognize, and this is my background as an educator, if we approach decisions, be it in for-profit or nonprofit, a business or school, what if we approach decision making as an exercise in learning? that we really went into it and said, we're going to use this to learn. So what do we know? What don't we know? And what do we need to know? And then we focused on questions. So that's part of it, is how much time when we make decisions do we focus on questions. Einstein, there's a quote from Einstein. He said that if I had a decision to make that my life depended upon, if I had an hour to make a decision that my life depended, I'd spend the first 50 minutes making sure I'm asking the right questions.
Right. You just bring that up and immediately it comes to mind. I think of the Supreme Court, where they have the lawyers get up and they ask questions, tons of questions. Is that kind of the model you're talking about? And I'm kind of curious what you think about that whole Supreme Court process.
I talk about Daniel Kahneman a lot, and two seminal books. He's a Nobel laureate. One book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And what he talks about there is sort of two systems of thinking. And the first one, system one, it's that impulsive, it's that quick response to a decision. We feel it. And he'll point out that often those decisions are not well considered and the outcomes aren't very good. And he talks about systems two thinking, which is a lot more deliberate, a lot more rational. He says we don't naturally calculate probabilities, but that it leads to better decisions. Malcolm Gladwell and Blank, different perspective. Intuitive decisions based on experience are good. But to your question about the Supreme Court, Kahneman's got another book called Noise. And the research is compelling. Judges in a courtroom, doctors with the same data, insurance adjusters with the same data set. And unequivocally, he shows how much noise, how susceptible we are to influences on our decision making that aren't rational. If you have to go in front of a judge, you want to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning and not 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Same case, same facts, same outcomes. Same is true with physicians. Look at the arguments we have between insurance companies and doctors about treatment. I watched something on NBC News last night. Same set of data, very different decisions. I hold myself back from commenting on politics in the
Sure.
arena that we're in. But one of the posts I wrote that got the most attention was on tariffs. Same economic data. Look at the differences we have. And frankly, you could apply the same thing right now to the government shutdown. If the question, what is happening to decision making in our country that our Congress can't function?
Right. Right. So let's get into the actual art of the decision making and the science. And I think one of the things too, before we jump all the way into that really grabbed me is a post you put up uh, a couple weeks ago about that intuition that we all have, the hunches that we work off of as leaders, which are valuable and extremely valuable. But what you said is sometimes that alone isn't enough. Could lead you in the wrong direction. And if you can use that in a context with some more, like you said, some data driven background, things like that, you have a much better decision. So take us through actually what is a good decision making process, if you would, Mike.
Yeah. So the first thing I start with clients, teams, and organizations is just better understanding your decision making style and then tendencies. And if you ask most people, they'll say, "Well, I'm rational or I'm intuitive." And the reality is that we're both elements of both, and the situation matters. But it's not. And some people we're going to skew towards being intuitive or rational. So, for example, I've learned, in particular as I do more research, intuition, it's emotion and it triggers quicker than our intellect or our cognition. So I'm highly intuitive, but I've learned to really pause, like Daniel Kahneman, let my rational mind catch up. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to make a completely different decision. There's a lot of decisions I've made that I've ignored my intuition and I've regretted it. So a good example about this is hiring. And Kahneman and Noyes speaks a lot about hiring. we hire and we form an impression based on intuition in the first few minutes of an interview. And hiring teams unequivocally, so then confirmation bias, which is one of the heuristics, is we tend to pay more attention to information that confirms a view that we have.
Right.
Or if you're in a search, representative heuristics, you always want to be the last one when you're in a search. And the placement recruiters will say, oh, no, it doesn't matter. It does matter. People remember the last thing that they've seen. So you actually, if you're a candidate, you're better positioned to go towards the end of a search than be the first person in. People are more inclined to hear the last piece of data that's uttered at the end of a meeting, which is why it's so important to manage a decision-making meeting in a particular way. In noise, for example, in hiring, Kahneman suggests that teams don't vet and share their information throughout the process because we're susceptible to who speaks first in a meeting. We're susceptible to the social power dynamics in a room, and it's significantly higher. So we're actually better. It goes against what most of us do, but to really, in a hiring decision, work in relative isolation and state your preferences and then analyze the recommendations after the fact.
Wow.
So those are some of the examples. So recognizing our styles, and we can do that in relatively easier ways. But I mentioned earlier, I've been working with Personas AI. It is a new piece of software. I'm using it in my coaching. I'm introducing it to companies. And it's in the genre of everything DISC, Clifton Strengths, but it's based on the 5-factor model of personality, which is really sort of the gold standard of the instruments to assess personality styles. But then it builds AI into it. So in addition to the data about your personality, you can put your own personal job description and preferences. You can add your company values. You can add your company's policies. You can load up all your everything DISC profile. And because of the LLM model, it can handle all of this data. But it then can be used, well, I'm going to meet with this team and we're under a lot of pressure because we haven't met our OKRs or whatever it is. How do I present this initiative to them in a way that these 4 individuals will be more receptive or more inclined to hear it? So it knows how they respond under pressure. It knows how information is best presented to them. It can help navigate conflict. I mean, it's an amazing tool. So styles and tendencies, and then skills. Decision making, it's a skill, and we can practice it and we can prove it. We're going to make thousands of decisions today, but some of them we want to make sure we make really well, really intentionally. So it's recognizing heuristics. It's, I'm listening to this information. Our news feeds right now are based on availability heuristic. Our news feeds feed us information that agree with what we already think.
Right. Big problem. Get into, keep going, because I really want to hear more about the skills that, as you say, what are those skills that elevate the clarity and confidence under pressure? So the heuristics, identifying them, are there more?
Yeah, there are. For example, surfacing and expressing assumptions. I mean, if I were to ask however many people are watching, but I ask this during presentations, how many of you, when you sit down with a team to make a decision, spend 10 minutes surfacing and expressing assumptions? And I rarely see hands go up. But expressing assumptions at the onset of a decision, there's research to support it, results in not only better outcomes, but it reduces conflict because unstated assumptions later on in a decision manifest as conflict. People like, well, I really believe, do I believe we need to make this an issue? Do we need to make a change? I mean, everything is working. Get those assumptions out at the onset. It also builds trust. It facilitates collaboration. Another one is framing. At the onset, frame the problem you're really addressing. And because what we do is we launch ahead, and the assumption is that everyone shares the same framework, and you're nodding because you know that that's rarely happens.
Right. Well, I'm thinking about it in terms of marketing too. We launch these campaigns, we assume what the customer wants, and there's all these things that could be factoring into those assumptions. And so a little more deliberate decision making process, I think, would help marketers. Speaking from experience here.
I've got a background in design thinking out of the D school at Stanford, and it's a creative way to solve complex problems. But one of the things it starts with is assumptions on the front end. We were doing a project once, a massive rethinking about how children learn in a particular age group. So we're working with Daylight Design out of San Francisco, and we were sitting in this cool studio in the Mission of San Francisco, and whiteboards and sticky notes. And so he asked us, well, how do we think kids, need to learn? And it didn't take us 10 minutes to have 100 sticky notes up on the wall. And then with dramatic flair, he pushed them all aside and said, those are your assumptions about the solution. Now let's go to work.
Wow.
And then, we were thinking about schools. We visited hospitals. We visited museums. We visited organizations that, like all these other organizations, to just broaden our minds about possibilities. And that led to a better decision. So the framing is important too. So you do assumptions, and then let's take 10 minutes and frame this problem to build shared understandings. But here's a good example. I read a case study about a humane society, and it was around the pandemic, but they had people returning animals that they'd adopted, and so they got together, they're bored, and we've got to figure out how to acquire more space and house more animals. And then somewhere along the line, something interrupted their thinking. They said, well, let's go out and find out what's going on. And so in the spirit of design thinking, they went out. Turns out people were returning the animals because they couldn't afford to feed them. So they pivoted and they went out and they got donations. They raised money to buy food. They found other sources of food. They could distribute it. And guess what? The amount of animals reduced significantly. People wanted to keep their animals. It was much more cost effective. But it's a good example of how you frame it at the onset. But there's things like evergreen contracts, or you look at how legislation is written. Legislation is written intentionally, framed in a certain way to lead us to certain outcomes. And this is why we have to be skilled at decision making.
So, Mike, let me ask you this: this is obviously a learned skill, because as you're telling me all these things to keep in mind, as as an owner, as a leader of my own organization, I'm thinking, how can I be instinctive and react to things and still keep all this stuff in the framework? And I'm a basketball player, so I always think about Michael Jordan and the fact that he learned fundamentals at North Carolina. And once he had the fundamentals of the game down, that's when his creativity could really explode. Is it a similar concept with decision making?
Yeah, I mean that's a great analogy, and I like the way you frame it. Like any skill, once you learn it, we become more fused. And so the neurology of that is this: is you've actually formed neural pathways so that you're more likely, with less effort, are going to go to those behaviors or physical movements. Here's what our brain does: is we are preconditioned by evolution to preserve calories as a way of survival instinct. Like, I don't want to burn calories because then I got to find more food. When
Right.
we form new neural pathways, which means when we are faced with change, our neurological predisposition is to resist it
Yeah.
until we can learn. Piano playing, free throws. Like, look at how you rehearsed a series of movements, and you were forging neural pathways. Decision making is the same. And so what organizations need to do is build a culture within their organization that forges neural pathways that leads to better decision making. I'm learning a whole new facilitation style right now with new software, new techniques, and man, my brain is challenged, which is good for me.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that will get easier. The problem is our neural pathways are built right now to perpetuate ineffective decision making models. That's why some people perpetually make bad decisions.
So we had just had a comment here from Anthony Moore: thinking with my imagination versus thinking with my memory is how I try and explain it. Not entirely sure what Anthony means there, and maybe Mike, but I guess that I'm kind of curious the imagination and how that factors in Because I always feel like I'm a writer too, so I have too much imagination sometimes, and that really clouds what I'm doing. And maybe that's kind of what Anthony's alluding to.
Well, I know, Anthony. So thank you for coming, Anthony, and thank you for a great question. And I mean, Anthony is an amazing thinker. I mean, I think presumably the question is this: is that imagination is going to take us into different parts of our brain. Um, Memory similarly, and where memories are stored, and how our brains allocate chemicals to trigger that. Um, I've been writing about how we rely on experience as a default, but often experience leads us to less than optimal decisions because we haven't used our imaginations to account for how circumstances might change. So they are paired, but my caution would be that don't abandon experience or memories when making decisions, but don't be locked into it, recognizing that our human precondition is to over rely on past practices.
So tell me, Mike, besides working with you, are there ways that you can create these systems that we're talking about and implement them? I mean, to me, I think we were talking before as well. Companies spend so much time on process. It's astounding how much time people spend on process. But to your point, nobody talks about decision making process. Is this something that we can institute on a company wide basis?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a little bit more data here. So this comes from the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, a study 2025 decision making in the workplace. 85% of executives say they have never received any training in decision making at any level of education. So
Yeah.
on LinkedIn, there's a foundation, decision education formation. They provide curriculum for schools. Our schools should be teaching decision making from the earliest ages, and we're not. So that's one. 84% of executives say they want decision making training.
Yeah.
Now, here's the gap. 91% of them think that they're effective decision makers. So you have this huge gap between we're not providing any training, but we also perceived ourselves as highly effective. And that's why we lead to our decisions. But to your question about why, we need to incorporate this into our educational systems, and we need to incorporate this into our work lives. I've asked now literally thousands of audience members. I speak at conferences. I just spoke at the National Meals on Wheels conference, and I've done this for crowds of 10 and crowds of 100. I'll say, how many of you have received training in leadership? And how many of you received training in safety protocols? And how many of you received training in technology? Hands all go. How many of you received training in decisions and how to make better decisions? And I'll get less than 5% in any given conference.
So let me ask you something about your clients. Do they sleep better at night? I mean, is this, if you are confident in your decision making, do you sleep better at night? I could see that is personal experience again, tossing and turning because I'm not sure I'm making the right call.
So that's what happens. And so the absence, so the third piece is style, is what's your style, your skills, and the third piece is having a framework. How would you feel if you were going to go visit somebody in California, and you're in the Midwest, and you said, well, I'm going to leave without a map and without a plan? And would you be more anxious about that trip than if you say, I've got my GPS, we're going to stop here? So why are we making decisions absence of a framework? And that contributes to the stress, the ambiguity, the lack of clarity. We also know that when we are under stress, the brain, so the amygdala is where the emotions are. We want to be making decisions from the frontal cortex, which is the more rational part. And the thalamus is like the switchboard, but the chemical, the energy of the brain when we're under stress channels all of that to the amygdala, to the emotions. And
Right.
that's why we make less optimal decisions under those conditions. So the answer to your question, I will say this now I saw it leading teams, and I see it now with clients. 97% of my sessions with clients are about a decision in some capacity. It's about an initiative they're thinking about launching. It's about a revenue problem they're trying to solve. It's about a personnel conversation they've got to have. All of those are decisions, and most decisions aren't a decision. They're series of decisions that lead to an outcome. I make one decision, which it's like a decision tree, and it takes me to another path. So the answer to your question is yes, they sleep better at night. And if we can reduce that tension, it takes us to parts of the brain that are more likely to make better decisions.
One last question, then we just have a couple more comments. We've talked about the whole process, the framework, the style, the skills. Is there anything external, though, that needs to be present for the decision making, like data, expert advice, things like that? And I'm thinking in terms of thought leadership. When you create, from a marketer who's helping people create thought leadership content, I think your own insights, your experience, expert advice, and data. Are you looking for some of those same things to, once you have the framework, that will lead to a better decision?
Yeah, I just posted last week, and I used the basketball analogy about shooting free throws. And there are conditions that are conducive to better decision making. One is an environment that's more stable and predictable. So when you're shooting a free throw, the clock is stopped, you're on a line, the ref's going to hand you the ball, and you're going to go through a motion. Well, decision making is the same. And so we should put ourselves in conditions, and it has to do with setting. It has to do with who you're making decisions you're with. It has to do with the information that you're going to have access to. Here's an example. In my life in schools, most board meetings are late in the afternoon or evening. When are we least likely? And that's where most significant decisions are made. Now, maybe it's practical and it's pragmatic, but think about that.
Yeah.
So, there's a simple example, and that's Kahneman's book on noise. But here, Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate, has got a theory about decision making. And what he basically says is this: it's called satisficing. He says at the end of the day, we're making decisions based on data that's less than perfect. We're making decisions based on time constraints. And we're making decisions based on actually really predictable limits in our ability to handle complexity. I mean, if we've got more time, I can talk about once our complexity gets overwhelmed, which is pretty quick, we're more susceptible to making impulsive decisions.
Wow, because you just want to get something out there.
Yeah, fascinating study. They gave two groups of people numbers to memorize. One 3 numbers, the other one 7 numbers. They sent them down a hallway, and they thought it was about memory. But halfway down the hallway, there was 2 tables. One table had healthy snacks. One table had sugary snacks. Which group do you think was more likely to choose the healthy snacks halfway down the hallway? The 7-digit group or the 3-digit group?
3-digit.
The 7-digit group selected was more likely to pick because they were working, their brains were working harder to remember 7 digits than the 3-digit group. The point is, when our complexity is maximized, we're more susceptible to impulsive decisions.
Okay. I would thought that they wanted the sugar because they were
Well,
frantic in there.
you're sort of like a marathoner on mile 20. Like, I'm just going to grab the sugar in whatever way I can get.
Yeah.
So we have to manage complexity when we're making decisions. And that's an important condition.
Yeah. One last comment here from Ken Usick. I hope I got that right. Making the journey and implementing strategy is a perfect analogy. And maybe talk a little bit more, if you could, to that, Mike. I'm not exactly sure what Ken, I think, might have been referring to something.
He's probably referring to, like, if we're going to take a trip. I mean, you look at all of the other things that we do in life, like we talk about our trips, and we have a plan, and we have a place to stay, and we have an itinerary. If you look at how we make decisions often in the corporate setting, we surround ourselves with the semblances of good decision making, but the data shows that 64% of the executives don't feel that we're making optimal decisions. And the point is, by implementing pretty basic systems and reinforcing them, it makes a huge difference. So one of the things I do is, you don't take a system off the shelf and jam it into a company. You go into an organization, you learn their culture, you learn their values, and then you craft a decision-making process that takes them through steps that fits who they are.
Nice. That makes
sense. And then they're more likely, because I talk to companies that, yes, they have decision-making systems, but nobody's using them.
Ah, interesting. Well, Mike, we are a little past the top of the hour. Fascinating topic. We could go on, I'm sure. If someone wants to talk to you and learn more about and possibly work with you about bringing in your expertise to help them make better decisions, how do they get a hold of you?
Mike at dynamicdecisionscoaching.com. Or, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. I post regularly on LinkedIn. Michael Walker, EDD on LinkedIn.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mike. Fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you. Great topic. Appreciate it. Always enjoy talking about it.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Thought Leaders Live.